Hello and welcome. Excuse me. Hello and welcome to episode 14. I'm going to get super teachery with this one, even though I feel a little more like Mark Mothersbaugh from Yo Gabba Gabba. But what I wanted to talk about is cognitive biases and how they affect the workshop system. And this connects with what I was talking about before with the fixation on liking and disliking on the one hand, but also good and bad. So how do you talk about improving a work of fiction or any art really, but how do you actually talk about improving an art form without talking about good or bad? And there's a way to chart it. There's a way to understand it. I have a system for self-reflection on what is a more valuable thing to really talk about. Instead of talking about good and bad, what is a more valuable thing to talk about? And much more valuable than liking and disliking. But so much discussion of improving a work of fiction is really fixated just on those ideas. I'll give you the original version of this. It's really a three-part system. It's sort of a chart where you separate things into three parts. So you can separate them into three parts any way you want to. The original version of the system, when I talk about this, I call it a Mogon, because that's the original version. And I got, when I saw Pi by Darren Aronofsky, I'm going to use Darren Aronofsky movies as an example, just because I got a lot of the imagery inspired from watching Pi in 1998, so 21 years ago. The Mogon, it's just, if you know sacred geometry or Kabbalah, that can get you, all kinds of distracted, but it's just a simple sort of structure for understanding intersections between things. And the original structure, if you could see that, if that's actually going to show up, I have no idea. Let me make it a little darker. A little darker. I don't know if it's going to show up on camera. There you go. That shows up a little better. Little structure, the original structure is just intersecting triangles. And it has a, it has a spiritual origin. Of course, you see it in Judaism. You see it in lots of other religions, and commonly it's interpreted as the emanation of God intersecting with the supplication of human beings. And you can separate it into three sections. There you go. Separate it into three sections. And you get I call it the Mogon because you get a Star of David, also known as the David Shield. That's just why I call it a Mogon. You don't have to do it in this shape. If I could do a straight line. Yeah, there you go. You don't have to do it in this shape. You can do it in any shape you want to, but sort of the idea is the emanation from God part of it parallels something that's always true. So we narrow it down to a smaller triangle because there are a smaller amount of elements, but it's also universal because it's a wider amount of elements. Down at the bottom is something that, in terms of opinions about art or fiction or what have you, it's something that just you hold, and that's really about it. It's a very, very narrow amount of things that just you personally like. So when you're talking about, there you go. This is my son's whiteboard. So you have Spider-Man stickers and Jurassic Park stickers, Iron Man. And Pork Chop. I don't know if you can see Pork Chop Happy sticker down there with David Bowie. The David Bowie lightning on his face. You could do it in a much easier form. I'm really sweating because my house is really hot right now. My air conditioner doesn't work. And it's getting to be 90 degrees. And doggies love to cuddle when it's hot. You don't need to cuddle when it's really hot. But you can do it in just three sections. I'm going to use these in a second. Yeah, that's all you really need, just three sections. I'm going to do a dark line, a thick line. Whether you use the triangles or not. The triangles that the Mogon, there's all kinds of backstories to that, and it connects in some interesting ways with, just to get off track very briefly. It connects to the treehouse. I looked at it in the last episode because my brother spontaneously said, here's a symbol that we should use, and it was the intersecting angles, and it looked kind of like a Masonic symbol. He said, here's a symbol we should use for our club, and we painted it on the side of our treehouse, and then mysteriously there was a big hole in the treehouse not long after that. So there was a personal conspiracy about who might have busted a hole in the treehouse. Was it the Masons or something like that? Because the symbol was kind of, the symbol is similar to the Masons. Masons use a lot of similar symbolism as Kabbalah. That's beside the point. But if you, this is another thing that can get really distracting. But I have 14 story sections, and they're organized in this hexagonal format, and it's really based on the Mogon. And you can get more complicated sacred geometry. You can get into the Metatron cubes and stuff like that. But that's really distracting. That's not really the purpose of why we're here today, Maggie. One day I'll explain the Metatron cube and how my 14 story collections are organized on it. Just purely to explain it to somebody one day. But you can break it down in 3 sections. And the top section is, if you think about something always true, you would, look at something like a universal value. Universal value. What is universally valuable about a story? What is the core value that makes one story good and will always make a story good, for example. And then, the universal good or bad, and then you can separate it as maybe whatever you want to call it, the common good. This is the universal good. This is always good, no matter what story you're talking about, no matter what piece of art you're talking about. This is the element that's always good. That's harder to really find effectively. I have an idea, and if you've seen any of my other videos, my longtime fans will know how it works with me. But common good just basically meaning something that you may or may not like personally, but you can get outside of your own head, and you can see how other people might consider something like this good. So it's a thing that you just personally dislike, or it's something you like, but you can still recognize that other people have the capacity to like it. And then down here you could put just opinion. Handwriting is terrible. Opinion. There you go. It's really smudgy. And the cognitive biases, the way the cognitive biases tend to work, that's one of the biggest problems with the workshop system itself. The workshop system has some deep structural flaws. Maggie's making noise by scratching next to the bed, which is metal. Are you done? You're making clanking metal noises. The workshop system has a lot of really essential structural flaws, and a couple of the flaws can be boiled down to a few cognitive biases. Part of the issue is you're gathering together a teacher plus a group of students who are just new to the field or amateurs in the field. And you're focusing primarily on critique of another student's work. And the critique tends to focus down here. And one of the I've talked about this a little bit before. What is your problem? You're being very noisy. One of the cognitive biases in behavioral economics is called the storytelling fallacy, which is not a good term for storytelling. What is the storytelling fallacy of storytelling? But the fallacy, it's something that affects focus groups. detrimentally. The idea that if you give them something, if a product or something like that, and you said, why is this product? Why do you like this product or dislike this product? And then you ask them to explain why. They may or may not be able to actually explain why. Experts can explain why. People who are really familiar with, a particular area of type of food. Food experts can explain why a food is good. Just your non-trained amateur is not going to be able to explain why particular food is good. And so they'll come up with a reason, but it'll be just a fake reason. Or if something's abnormal, something can be really good, but challenging to the system. So it could be the best example of something, but brand new, and people react to newness by rejecting it frequently. Something that's outside of the norm. They mix that up with just being bad, and that's not the same thing, clearly. Be still. I'm in a rocking chair, and she's pushing me. Be still. Can you be still? Do you want the show to be about you? You want the show to be about you, I'm sure. Okay. Be still. Be still. What was that? So, somebody can identify something as bad, but what they really mean is just, I'm not familiar with it. And so by its very nature, the focus group tends to favor the familiar. So focus groups are really well with things that are already popular. Focus groups are not, you wouldn't take an independent movie and focus group it necessarily, because it's going to have a lot of abrasive things that the audience might not like. But it's irrelevant. If they like it, it still could be a great movie, whether or not their first impression is that they like it. Hush, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? You're so noisy. So that's one of the fallacies. The other one, is confirmation bias, which confirmation bias, I knew that a lot of the flaws with the work structure were based on the fallacy. I've been looking for what the fallacy is for years. I don't think confirmation bias is the perfect one to apply here. This is, I'm sure there's a better name for the fallacy. I just haven't ever been able to find it. Because confirmation bias, be still. Confirmation bias, do you want to leave? Do you want to leave? I could just kick you out. If you can't be still. Do you understand me, dog? Do you understand me? Do you understand me? So confirmation bias is, here, I'll hold up my feet. Confirmation bias is, commonly it's choosing the evidence that Can you stop? Okay. Confirmation bias is commonly choosing the evidence that fits whatever you already believe. And famously, this is a obstacle in teaching science, for example. A scientist has, some sort of explanation that might be uncomfortable, and you can see how these work together. The scientist might have an explanation that's uncomfortable for the public rejects it, and they'll find evidence, or, they'll find pseudoscience, or they'll find, they'll shape the evidence to fit their pre-existing beliefs. That doesn't work perfectly when you're talking about something subjective, like what makes... Stop. That doesn't work perfectly for something subjective, like what makes a piece of fiction good. But there are fallacies that people use that are arguments in bad faith, you might call them, where they're using evidence. They're forcing evidence through subjective interpretation to fit a pre-existing concept of a universal good. That sounds very fancy and smart. Let me say that again, because it sounds so fancy and smart. I'm impressed with how smart that sentence sounded. They use... What did I say? In subjective situations, they use confirmation bias to interpret evidence subjectively in order to fit a preconceived universal good. And that's argument of bad faith. It's intellectually dishonest, really. But how can you really stop? Just go away. Just go away. The off-screen shenanigans of two canine clowns who make a lot of noise. Okay, stop. You can just sit. You can sit right there as long as you're still. What was I say? And just to be clear, this is another thing that, just to be clear, I'm not talking about things like critical theory. I just personally have never found critical theory all that helpful in writing fiction, but it's essentially talking about something different. There's not a whole lot of critical theory where, on the subjective level, it's definitely not talking about opinion. A critical theory won't take an art piece and talk about necessarily the elements that make it good or appealing to the public or what have you. That's something the artists will certainly do, and that's really relevant to the artist, but that's not necessarily critical theory. And universal good, there's a lot of discussion of universal good, but in a very different context. Universal good meaning, how can you determine something within an art piece that is universally good? And there are areas of philosophy that certainly cover that. I don't really agree with them, but I'm not saying their arguments are necessarily bad. Just not that useful for the artist. They're useful for the philosophers, just not that useful for the artist. Quick coffee break. Okay. That being said, I said I was going to take Darren Aronofsky's movies and use them as an example. This is an exercise that you can do just for self-exploration. My audience I'm a James Bond villain all of a sudden. My audience, I assume, is my grandkids, but it might be somebody who finds this useful, who knows, in the far distant future. That one person who needs this. I always wanted something like this, and so I just had to make it up myself. But this is an exercise that you can do where you can take any piece and treat it. Take any piece you like or any piece you dislike, and as a starting point, just treat it as the only piece of art that exists in the world. And try to determine what elements from that art piece are good and what are bad. Is that your opinion? Can you recognize why other people might like or dislike it or find a different opinion than you? Are there elements that you can safely guess are common good, a concept of good or a concept of bad that the general public would agree with? And can you take any of those elements? Can you take any of those elements and elevate them to a universal good? So if you take something like, since I started with, I'll start with a biblical story, Darren Aronofsky story. Darren Aronofsky's version of Noah. Not his most well-received movie. It has a real basic story, so it's kind of easy to boil down in some ways. But Darren Aronofsky's version of Noah, we'll start there. Well, then we'll get to Black Swan and Requiem for a Dream, and I talked about Mother before, but I'll touch on Mother again. And Pi. Pi was the movie that gave me a lot of the imagery, the Kabbalah imagery. Started that trend for myself personally. So, if you think about Noah, a lot of Noah is really forgettable, even though it's a familiar story. The actual movie itself, I was trying to think what was in the movie and what am I mixing up with the actual biblical story. But I can easily identify something that would go down here, which is monsters. I love monsters. Any story with monsters is going to get a thumbs up from me. It's just my one thing that I personally love. Let's see. Which magnet should I use for monsters? I have all these magnets. Let me use red button. I'm going to use red button. So, red button stands in for monsters. I can safely identify monsters. And Noah, if you haven't seen Noah, I didn't really like Noah, so you can, of all the Darren Aronofsky movies, that's probably one you can skip. But it has these rock monsters. I guess they're supposed to be the Nephilim, and Nephilim are giants in the Bible. I don't know. It's kind of iffy how that works, but it's got these cool rock monsters. It's a cool design, and what have you. So yeah, I mean, rock monsters, easily can identify that. It's just definitely something I love in a story. Most of my stories have some kind of monster in them. And then, the next thing you might identify is, let's say, so it's a story of it's a story of a character fighting against the system, let's say. So, it's, everybody thinks Noah's crazy, he's fighting against the system. So, it's an underdog story. So, could I, just thinking about that one story, could I say all stories should be an underdog story? Well, no, I wouldn't say all stories should be an underdog story. But underdog stories, a lot of people love underdog stories. A lot of people love monsters, I realize. But, this is a flowing chart, can go up and down, just depending on, your perception. This is a way of meditating and figuring these things out for yourself. So I'm going to use the Cowardly Lion and say, there you go, Cowardly Lion. He's like Noah, he's an underdog. He, fights despite lack of capacity to fight. I just noticed my Tin Man has the axe head missing. My poor Tin Man. I'll get around to Tin Man. So, Noah is also this is an interesting point just to keep in mind. This is why we'll probably go to Black Swan next. I'm not sure which one I'm going to use for Black Swan. But it's it's a family story. It's a little teeny tiny magnet that says family. I just grab these magnets from my food. It's a family story. Family stories are, have a lot of drama in them, have a lot of intense emotions in them. It has... Hold on. There you go. For me, a surreal, dreamlike quality... This is dream. For me, a surreal, dreamlike quality is something that I really love. Darren Aronofsky uses that a lot. Noah has it, and that shows up constantly. But I could safely say not everybody really likes that. It's just a mood that I'm fond of. Let me see. One thing I was gonna... one thing that relates to... I'm looking for one that will stand in for beauty. Beauty. Let's see. Which one will stand in for beauty? My poor Scarecrow's arm is coming off too. I need to get new Wizard of Oz magnets. Let's just say, hold on. There's a bunch of chalk everywhere. Because there's a chalkboard on the other side of this, so chalk is everywhere. Okay, so let's just call this beauty. This will be beauty. It says Happy New Year. Happy New Year. They're beauty. Okay, so it's a beautiful movie, arguably. So, the beauty of the landscapes and all that sort of stuff. And this relates to what I talked about with Mother. It has an environmentalist message. Darren Aronofsky loves those. So, political messaging. I'm going to choose Thanos. Thanos is a character who, in the MCU version, has a political message. It's an environmentalist message. Not my favorite version of Thanos. Thanos' motivation, as I've talked about before. One of my favorite characters of all time. I think this is a Mark Bagley. Yeah, I think this is a Mark Bagley picture, but I'm not sure what story that's from. I'm going to nerd out about Thanos, of course. So let's say my hypothesis. This is my hypothesis. Um, political argumentation and having a political message, that is a universal good. That is something that's always going to be something good in a story. That is my argument for right now. I don't agree with it, but I'll let that. I also have bunny rabbits. For me, I'm always going to put this up in the universal good as a universal good that I actually believe in. Stimulation of the empathetic experience, whether positive or negative. For me, the bunny's going to stay. I'm just, spoiler alert, the bunny's going to stay up there. But beauty, something that's really beautiful, there's a political message. I'm proposing, maybe if I watch Noah, I can get the sense that maybe that's the universal good. One of the problems with Noah is that I didn't like it. It's beautiful, it has monsters, all this stuff I liked, but the rest of it I didn't really like. Which is kind of forgettable. Like the character of Noah, who's an underdog and a family man, and all that kind of stuff. But I think, and a lot of this is personal, because just knowing Noah in the Bible is a very complicated character for sure. And I think this was fighting against this. That would be an interesting fight. Poor Cowardly Lion wouldn't have much of a chance, but I think this was fighting against this. The idea that he was just standing in allegorically for, and this is the problem I talked about with Mother. Russell Crowe was playing Noah. Noah was just standing in allegorically for the fight to bring more attention to, the environment, what have you. I think for me that's something that really brought the movie down. But I would look at this and meditate and say, is that my opinion? Do I just personally not like that? If I personally dislike that, could it be a universal good? And so here you have hints of the confirmation bias. So if somebody, for me, confirmation bias is I don't really like a political allegory. I like Thanos as a character. His political allegory is not what I like about him as a character. But do I just dislike it? Am I forcing it to, am I saying it fails because of the political allegory is not very good? The sticker's coming off again. Am I saying it failed because the political allegory is not very good? But somebody who says every story should have political allegory would say, well, it's just a badly formed political allegory. I don't know if I mentioned last time that personally, I totally agree with these environmental messages. It has nothing to do with just my personal belief system on the environment. It's definitely something I'm feeling lots of global warming at the moment. I know that's a misconception. That was just a joke. But there are lots and lots of just really bad movies, in my personal opinion, really bad movies with an environmentalist message. Mother being one of them, Noah being one of them, Birdemic in 2012, The Day After Tomorrow, whatever it's called. The Day After Tomorrow might have done more harm for the environmentalist movement than anything, than it did good. But anyway, that's beside the point. But let's say I'm just looking at Noah and I said, if I hypothetically enjoyed this movie, what I would hypothetically enjoy about it is the environmental message. If we agree that it's not a very good movie, despite the fact that it has an environmental message, the confirmation bias might say it could be good with the environmental message, but the environmental message fails. So that's where the confirmation bias comes in. So you take that. This is my hypothesis. These might be things that I propose might be universal good. So then I look at something like Black Swan. And Black Swan is a very beautiful movie for sure. If I take here's the exercise. I skipped a step, but the exercise is take each movie like it's the only movie that exists. So if I said no is the only movie that exists, my hypothesis might be that environmental messaging is a universal good. If I took Black Swan and treated it as the only movie that exists, just as a starting point, I might still come to the conclusion that a universal good is that a movie is beautiful. And then, but I would not come to the conclusion that it has environmental messages. But if I'm just looking at Black Swan, and that's it, and nothing else, could I reasonably? This is the argument of bad faith part of it. Could I reasonably ever look at Black Swan entirely out of context, as if it's the only movie in existence, and say all movies have some political message, whether it's environmentalism or not? Arguably, you can't really do that. But people will, a lot of times with political messaging, especially that one, people will say everything is politics because Black Swan is about human beings, and human beings are political animals. It has to be political. That's confirmation bias, that's argument in bad faith, and that really has nothing to do with genuinely, legitimately, and honestly looking at what makes a movie like Black Swan beautiful. Arguably. I know plenty of people disagree and get really angry at me for this kind of stuff. So I'll take this off. Goodbye. I love you, Thanos, but you're going away. So let's see. What would I do next? So like with Black Swan, I like ballet. So I'd add this in here. There's Dorothy. I don't know. I don't really have one that's good to represent ballet. In the original movie, they had a jitterbug dance. I have summer and autumn. That doesn't really work. Maybe I'll I'll do this for ballet. Lemon and Ada. There you go. Maybe Dorothy could be, another underdog. So, I like ballet, I like monsters, I like dreamy imagery. Black Swan has all those things, so I like Black Swan. Black Swan's just one of my favorites, probably my second favorite Darren Aronofsky movie. And it's beautiful, so that's, all the imagery is, just beautiful from beginning to end. Has lots of monstrous, freaky, ugly things. But, it's pretty consistently beautiful. One of the things I might add, is, let's say hypothetically, let's use Alice. We're all quite mad here. I might say it's a scary movie. It's the main character, Natalie Portman's character, descending into madness and descending into, the intensity of the demands of ballet and hallucinating and all this sort of stuff. Sort of connects with this one. But I could say, things like fear and terror and deep exploration of somebody's psyche and all that sort of stuff. And arguably, there's a case that I could put it up here. This is one that may or may not float up here. Could I say fear is a universal good? That would be really harder. Could I say deep dives into somebody's psychological disorders? That would be harder to do. So I'm going to put it up here. But beauty has a strong case. And that's another example of where, you might argue, for example, catharsis, and that's a whole other complicated argument, you might say. And this is kind of what Aristotle did, coming up with that concept, looking at the plays of his time and saying what works and which one and why does it work, which part is better than another. And he's aiming for some sort of universal good, and that's where he comes up with catharsis. And I would argue something like Black Swan, I would argue, doesn't really have a catharsis. it just has extreme emotions. I'm keeping this one up here because that does have extreme emotions. And then it, leaves those off at the end, but that's eliminating those emotions. That's not the purpose of Black Swan, for example. So all that, there's a fair argument there that those work. But then you look at something like, this is why it's hard to rank the Darren Aronofsky, because The Wrestler is probably my favorite Darren Aronofsky. Requiem for a Dream is up there too. I mean, Requiem for a Dream, The Wrestler, Black Swan, those sort of mix and match together for my favorites. But if you start off with your proposal that something just being beautiful is a universal good, there are a lot of these classic Greek concepts like balance, which is just not true at all. There's a lot of interesting ideas there about how to create this organic sense of balance, and why that might be stimulating. But to say balance is a universal good is entirely not true. Because balance can be very destimulating. It can be stimulating. It can be very destimulating. So if you look at something like The Wrestler, where if you think of all of Aristotle's rules about how catharsis works, you have a character who does not fit any of the rules that Aristotle, arguably. Very few of the rules, I should say. But if you talk about The Wrestler, let's see, which one can I do for The Wrestler? So The Wrestler, I like wrestling. Lots of wrestling comes from North Carolina. Lots of great wrestlers come from North Carolina, so I'll use my North Carolina magnet. I'll say, and that's definitely an opinion, There's not a whole lot of sophisticated artists who give respect to wrestling. I give a huge amount of respect to it. But the wrestler, Randy the Ram, is based on Jake the Snake. I love Jake the Snake. I think he's a fascinating guy. It's sort of like with Noah, where that version of Noah is sort of underplaying the character complexity of Noah from the Bible, and all the different complexities of Noah from the Bible. And Randy the Ram is a tragic character in so many ways, and dark and complicated. But Jake the Snake is arguably so much worse. He has such a dark life that it would slip into the dream territory to do just an accurate version. But anyway, that's just something I like personally. If you've seen Beyond the Mat, The Wrestler is basically the Jake the Snake part from Beyond the Mat. But if I could say, what, other than that just personal thing I like, what moves into this territory of something other people would like? If you're not a big fan of Jake the Snake, can you still like The Wrestler? Can you still, appreciate Randy the Ram? Well, he's an underdog, fighting against his declining age. I mean, he's not really fighting against the system, like Noah is. And there are a lot of similarities between Randy the Ram and Natalie Portman's character from Black Swan, in that they are artists. That is an argument to make, that Randy the Ram is an artist. He's definitely an artist, according to me. But Randy is fighting to continue his art, because that's the only thing that brings him joy. One thing, I haven't talked about the hero's journey. I need to talk about the hero's journey and why I hate the hero's journey. But Dorothy's usually associated with that, falsely. That's a whole complicated video later. But it's a hero who goes on a journey and returns home and what have you. And, that's commonly something that you can find down here. Looks like the Cowardly Lion's going to punch Dorothy. Dorothy actually punches the Cowardly Lion, so let me put her over here. He's running away. He's running away from her. Just kidding, they're friends. So, and then Randy the Ram, it's a deep dive into there's not a lot of scary parts, but it's a deep dive into his psychology. There's a little bit of family stuff in there for sure. You know, the interactions with his daughter, and with Marissa Tomei. But would you really say it's a beautiful movie? No, it's a very gritty movie. And Marissa Tomei is in it. She's beautiful. I don't want to, say anything negative about Marissa Tomei. Excellent actress for many, many years. That's not saying anything about her. Everything else in the whole movie is hard to argue that anything else in the movie is actually beautiful. I think wrestling can be beautiful, and that's a whole other argument too. Jeff Hardy, who is from North Carolina, that's his whole aim. Is he talks a lot about the beauty of a particular wrestling move. It can be beautiful. That's not the beautiful part of it though. When Randy the Ram is fighting Necro Butcher and pulling staples out of him, that's great. But it's I love it just personally, but that's not what I would call beautiful in the same way that Swan Lake is beautiful, for example. So it's hard to really justify the Swan Lake type of beauty being a universal good. And so the confirmation bias would come in, and I would say you can't really say beauty is a universal good in art, because not all stimulating art is necessarily beautiful. And the confirmation bias would come in and say, well, it's still beautiful, or what have you. They're beautiful in the same way, and it wouldn't really force those to work together. One thing, this is a really significant one that I want to talk about. One of the more significant things that I do want to talk about. Let me see which magnet I can use for this. I'll use Frank Sinatra. It's Sinatra's world. We just live in it. I'm going to call this realism, because this is a very realistic message. Frank Sinatra is the secret ruler of the world. So let's say Randy the Ram is very realistic for sure. This is one of the areas where this becomes one of the biggest problems by far. Is realism, my old friend realism. So let's say I look at something like The Wrestler and I say, The Wrestler's good because it's a realistic depiction. It's basically the biographical movie of Jake the Snake Roberts. Everything about it is pretty realistic. If something is not realistic, then it's bad, something like that. But then you look at something like Black Swan. It has a lot of quote-unquote, I hate the term realism anyway, and unrealistic anyway, but has a lot of quote-unquote non-realistic things in it. But then you say, that's really just a deep dive into her, her madness. It's still realistic, but it's the non-real parts are just in her mind. Or if you look at something like Noah, and you say, well, there are monsters in Noah, and you say, well, Noah's not realistic. A lot of times people use the argument, Noah's not realistic, but it's also bad. Which is not a good argument. Is its unreality what makes it bad? That means every depiction of Noah must be bad, for that same reason. Or they'll say it's allegorical, and that's one of the big problems that I have with that sort of concept. I love Frank Sinatra, but I hate to associate him with that, but he's a realistic guy for sure. So if you talk about realism being a universal good, then the only place for imagination is allegory. A huge amount of problems with that. One of them being that it's extremely limiting to the imagination. To say that the only reason the imagination exists is for allegory. But you can argue that with something like The Wrestler. And so you can also argue that with something like, if you could move on to Requiem for a Dream, if you just put The Wrestler and The Requiem for a Dream, if you pretend those were the only two movies in existence, it's fairly realistic. It's Hubert Selby probably getting pretty close to his actual experience, maybe. If you just put both of those together, you might say good movies are gritty and dark and intense. I'm going to put Summer up there because I'm really hating Summer right now. Summer is really gritty and dark and intense for me right now. In South Carolina. I love South Carolina. Food. And nature. And people. Mostly. Not all. Maybe half. Don't love South Carolina summer. But where was I? So maybe you could say, if you just look at those two, you could say good movies are gritty and they're realistic. And they're stimulating regardless of positive or negative stimulation. And so, then you compare that to Black Swan and you say, it can't have these two as both universal goods. Arguably. But Requiem for a Dream, again, that's another one where, if you talk about catharsis and you talk about any of Aristotle's rules, they don't really pan out. They don't really work. Because everybody ends in a terrible place. They don't fall from a high place. They're in a very low place and fall even lower. The place they end up with, arguably there's no real purging of negative emotions. But Requiem for a Dream is an easy one to disprove catharsis as a universal good. Then you get to something like The Fountain. The Fountain is one it's kind of a divisive one. It has had a resurgence. It has had a resurgence. So, a lot of people saying, when it came out, I don't think a lot of people really loved it, but I love Hugh Jackman. I just kind of forgot about it. I remember liking it. I just, I had a hard time remembering a lot about it, but it has a whole sci-fi section in it. So if you take any sort of sci-fi, and you said, realism, on the one hand, if you said realism can't be a universal good because that means sci-fi must all be bad. And a lot of people, when they first saw The Fountain, said that. But a lot of people just, it seems recently, a lot of people say, well, wasn't The Fountain really good? That's kind of a forgotten masterpiece or what have you. But any sort of sci-fi story. But this is confirmation bias, this is my argument. To say that the only way that a sci-fi can be good is if it is an allegory for something realistic. Is confirmation bias. It's the desire for realism to be a universal good and trying to force imaginative work to fit into that as a universal good. And so it's argument in bad faith, intellectually dishonest, and just wrong. It's one of those things that we just take for granted. I would put it down here. I wouldn't even put it here, I would put it down here. It's not my opinion. Realism doesn't do much for me, but I like, realistic pieces like The Wrestler or Requiem for a Dream, but I also like monsters. Also like ballet. So yeah, I would eliminate realism. Any sort of imaginative work, I could say with confidence, any imaginative work could easily disprove that. And you can look at the flip side. Anything that you dislike, you can also flip it around. So something like Noah, I didn't really like Noah, but the reason I didn't like Noah was because I didn't really... Russell Crowe is a good actor, but I didn't really find the character interesting or appealing. It was just kind of bland. Not nearly as interesting as The Cowardly Lion. And same thing with Mother. And Mother is not realistic, and you could argue that it is an allegory, certainly. But I think that's the biggest problem with it. That's the detriment of Mother, is it's too allegorical to make for interesting characters, unfortunately. Jennifer Lawrence is a great actress. Javier Bardem tries his hardest to make that character interesting. There are interesting moments, but just the allegorical quality of it just ruins it, if you ask me. But that's an argument in the negative, that treating a text, a non-realistic, imaginative text. Non-realistic is such a negative term for it, but an imaginative text. Treating an imaginative movie or story like Mother as just being allegorical is more of a problem than it is an argument for realism. So it's more of a identification of what ruins the characters in the movie, more so than argument for realism. So this is how I came to this conclusion. This is where this comes from, is doing this. Let me see if it'll stand. I might keep this up here so this can stay up here the whole time. But my bunny rabbit friends up here. You could do this with any set of stories. Just any story you like, any story you dislike. Run them through this. I didn't even talk about Pi, but Pi. The structure of that story is similar to Black Swan. It's gritty like The Wrestler, but a lot of it is the story is similar to Black Swan, so it's kind of the same ideas. You might look at something like Pi and say, good stories must have math, and that's clearly not true. But math, math is one. I always use this example when people say that all stories should be political because politics is in everything. We are human beings, and human beings are political. That's like saying that all things are mathematical. But they're only mathematical because you put the math on them. If you look at a tree and say that tree is 20 feet tall, math is everywhere. Is that tree naturally 20 feet tall? No, you introduce the math into the situation in order to measure it for yourself. So it's a way of measuring, not something that is intrinsic to all things. So anyway, not to get off track, but Pi just brings that up. So anyway, that's how I came up with the center of the rainbow circle, which used to be the name of the show. The center of the rainbow circle, the idea is empathetic, emotional experiences are viscerally stimulating experiences, regardless of positive or negative. So if you look at something like Black Swan, or a lot of the imagery from Swan Lake, Swan Lake, this beautiful ballet, and then you put it side by side with The Wrestler, or Requiem for a Dream, or Pi, where it's really gritty and dark and intense. How are those two really working the same if one is beautiful and one is ugly, arguably? They're both stimulating, but it's not a dualistic positive-negative. So it's not, if we just made our universal good just things that are good otherwise, if we just said that, something that would be clearly false would be to say a good artwork makes you feel happy. Something like The Wrestler, I feel happy because I like it, but at the end of a movie like that, you feel depressed. It's still a great movie, but it's a very depressing movie. And Pi, very depressing movie. And Requiem for a Dream, one of the most depressing movies ever made. So that's, if you said your universal good was that an artwork makes you feel positive feelings, then that's easily disprovable. And that's kind of where the delusion of catharsis comes from, is that the idea that emotions, the Greek concept that emotions are always bad, which is clearly false, and that the only reason to indulge in something is to, balance your emotions or feel good afterwards. Catharsis makes us feel good after we have this negative experience. That is confirmation bias. It's the idea that logical, rational human beings shouldn't pursue experiences that make them feel bad because that's irrational and illogical. So why would they have empathetic experiences that make them feel bad? Why would a logical, rational human being ever watch Requiem for a Dream and feel terrible afterwards? Well, it must be because, logically, the only reason for that is to get rid of the emotions. Well, that's not true. If it's easily disprovable, but for centuries, or millennia, people have sort of forced things into that through confirmation bias. But if you said the value of the art, at its most essential and universal, the value of an art is to stimulate the reader through this empathetic experience. If it's a story, it's an empathetic experience. Other artwork, it doesn't have to be an empathetic experience. And you can do this with all genres. You can say, how does this work with a sci-fi piece, or how does this work with visual art? How does this work with music? But if you said the universal value of an artwork is its ability to stimulate the reader or viewer or listener or whatever, disregarding the dualistic positive negative value, and make the reader or viewer feel something intensely. And then you apply that to Requiem for a Dream. You say, yes, absolutely, that's what's going on in Requiem for a Dream. It's making me feel all of these horrible, horrible feelings, but I enjoy these horrible, horrible feelings, not in a positive sense necessarily, but it's not irrational to say, I enjoy feeling depressed after I watch a movie like Requiem for a Dream. That's just how it works. But our logic, and our logic is up here, our logic resists accepting this notion that we enjoy feeling bad. If I watch something like The Wrestler, he has kind of an ambiguous, triumphant ending. There's an indication that, maybe he's continuing his horrible life, or maybe he dies in the ring, or maybe, it's his last match. There's a lot of ambiguity to the end. So, we have a sort of a bump of positive feelings. But there's really... Requiem for a Dream probably is the most bleak and dark ending of a movie. One of the most bleak and dark endings of a movie. So it's hard to say after that one that you have anything to feel good about. But it's still excellent. It's one of my favorite Darren Aronofsky movies. And same goes with Pi. Pi has a lot of really lofty ideas about knowing God and stuff like that, but still ultimately it makes you feel terrible afterwards. But it's an excellent movie. And that's really arguably the only quality that could qualify as a universal good, is that stimulation. And that's how the rainbow circle functions. It emanates outward. Doesn't quite work exactly. The three-part Mogon system of universal good, common good, and opinion was a starting point where I came to this conclusion. It doesn't quite work in the exact spectrum of subjectivity and objectivity. Arguably, the universal good should be the most objective level, and the opinion should be the most subjective level. In this case, the center it's non-dualistic, so it's simultaneously the most objective and most subjective. And that's kind of the tricky thing with understanding how it works. You're moving in a spectrum towards unification of objectivity and subjectivity. It's a bit of a mind bender, I realize. And that's why, this system, the back of my thing is very humble looking. That's why this system, I think, simplifies it. You don't have to necessarily tackle the cognitive difficulty of imagining the simultaneity of subjectivity and objectivity necessarily. It does work that way, but you can simplify it to the spectrum of objective and subjective. But anyway, I think that's one of the best tools to really assess how valuable feedback of any kind in an artwork is. And a lot of time is occupied in something like a workshop. Arguably, too much time, way too much time. Most of the time is spent on saying things like, I really liked how blah, blah, blah. Or, according to this particular cliche, this is something that works in a story. Show, don't tell can help your story, whatever. Not nearly enough time is, and I would argue that the whole structure is flawed because building a whole system around what is essentially a focus group is flawed to begin with, but another really essential flaw is fixating on these two things that aren't really going to get you very far in understanding what actually makes a piece good or bad. But anyway, I think that's about it. I could probably I'll probably do this with another set of stories because it's a very useful sort of scheme to use for a whole wide variety of different stories. Darren Aronofsky doesn't have a huge amount of more purely imaginative pieces. Usually, two of his imaginative pieces are overtly allegories, and those are his worst ones, if you ask me. And really, the only truly imaginative piece he has is the Fountain, but and only really 1/3 of that. So I would like to do this with an imaginative piece later. Let me know in the comments what you would like me to cover in this way. Speaking of imagination, I'm imagining that I have an audience. That I am a very imaginative person. But anyway, I'll wrap it up for today and see you next episode.